In this lecture, we'll start with conformity. You'll learn why bartenders see the tip jar, why people prefer waiting in line sometimes, and why MBAs often end up pursuing the same careers right before they graduate, even though they started out with quite different aspirations in mind. You'll also learn why conformity sometimes leads us to follow others, even when we know those others are wrong, and how imitation leads people to take kidneys that they shouldn't in a kidney transplant list, or turn down kidneys that they should, even when accepting them would have saved their lives. When do we follow others, and why? Well, people tend to follow the behaviors of others around them. We listen to the same music as our friends, buy similar cars to our neighbors, and follow the same religion as our parents. Not always, but often. Whether making simple decisions like which dog food to buy at the store, or more consequential ones like who to vote for or where to send our children to school, we tend to do the same things as others around us. This is why bartenders, for example, and baristas, they see the tip jar at the beginning of their shift. They drop off a handful of ones or maybe a 5, a few coins, because they know that if the tip jar is empty, customers might assume that other people aren't tipping. And if other people aren't tipping, they're not going to tip themselves. But if the tip jar already has some money in it, if it looked like a couple of other customers have already contributed a few of their hard-earned dollars, then people will assume that others must be tipping, and thus they should tip as well. As we'll talk about, conformity happens for 2 key reasons. And the first reason is about information. Consider for a moment one of your organs you don't think very much about, your kidneys. In fact, you have 2 of them, but imagine that one of them fails. Your body relies on your kidneys to filter waste products and toxins from your blood. So when a kidney stops working, your whole body suffers. Your bones weaken, sodium builds up, and you're more likely to develop anemia or heart disease. If not treated soon, you will die. Kidney failure is a big, big deal. And in fact, it affects many people every year. Every year, more than 40,000 people in America come down with end-stage renal disease. One of their kidneys fails for one reason or another, and they don't have many options except for 2. To go through very time-intensive visits back and forth to a treatment center 3 times a week for 5 hours of dialysis, or to get a kidney transplant. Going back and forth isn't ideal, right? 5 hours of dialysis 3 times a week, extremely painful, or to get a kidney transplant. So most people would prefer the transplant, but here's the problem. Unfortunately, there are not enough kidneys available to be transplanted. Over 100,000 patients are on the wait list, and thousands more are added each month. People on the wait list are not surprisingly very eager to get a kidney. If they don't, they may not live much longer. So imagine for a second you're on that wait list for the kidney. Imagine you know that you need a kidney transplant, and you're just waiting to find one of the available kidneys on the list. It's used on a first-come, first-served basis. The people on the top of the list, well, they get the first shot at the available kidneys. And they're assigned sequentially to people down the list. So if the first person says no, the second person gets it, and so on. And the people on the top of the list, they've usually been waiting the longest. Now, imagine you for a moment. Imagine you need that kidney, and imagine you're sitting there waiting for months on end. You're low down on the list, but finally, with a stroke of luck, one day you're offered a potential match. Would you take it? You've been waiting on that list for months on end. Would you take the kidney? Well, clearly, people in need of a kidney to save their lives should take one when offered. Everyone should take the kidney. But surprisingly, around 97% of kidney offers are refused. Now, just for a moment, that's not all for superfluous reasons. Some of the refusals have a very good reason, and they're based on the kidney not being a very good fit in some sense. If you think about it, a kidney is a little bit like a car part. An organ transplant is a little bit like getting something replaced in your existing automobile. It's tough to put a Toyota carburetor in a Mercedes and vice versa. It's actually pretty much the same with a kidney. The blood or the tissue type doesn't match, the organ won't work. So some of the people turning down those kidneys are turning them down for a good reason. It doesn't match with them and their blood type. But when researchers looked deeper, and they looked at hundreds of kidneys that were donated over time, they found that social influence led people to turn down available kidneys even when they should have accepted them. Say you're the 200th person on the list. A kidney would have originally been offered to the first person on the list, and then the second, and then the third, and then the fourth, and so on. If you're 200th on the list and you just got offered a kidney, that means that it must have been turned down by 199 other people first. 199 other people already said no to this kidney. And this is where social influence starts to have a little bit of effect. If so many other people have refused this kidney first, people are going to start to assume that something must be wrong. Well, if everyone else said no, what am I missing? They infer that the kidney must be of low quality and are more likely to turn it down themselves. In fact, such inferences lead to 1 out of every 10 kidney refusers to do so in error. Some people refuse it for good reasons, but 1 out of 10 ends up turning one down that they should have accepted. Thousands of people end up rejecting kidneys that they should have accepted because of social influence. Researchers call this phenomenon the sound of silence. It's silence in the sense that people didn't hear other people turning it down. They didn't hear other people say, this is a bad kidney, but merely being aware that someone else turned it down affected their behavior. People aren't communicating directly with others on the list, but they make their decisions based on those others' behavior. And those decisions have a big impact. So one reason people conform then is because they're trying to figure out the right thing to do in a given situation. Should I take this kidney or not? And how can I use others as information about the right thing to do? Say it's spring and there's a small chance that it might rain. Maybe it will, maybe it won't, but it's hard to be sure. How do you know whether you're supposed to bring an umbrella? Well, one time-tested trick is to see what others are doing. If other people are carrying umbrellas, you probably should bring yours. If no one's carrying an umbrella, you can probably skip it. People imitate others then, in part because others' choices provide useful information. It's called informational influence. Many decisions we make on a daily basis are like the decision to carry an umbrella. Where should we go on vacation this year? Which preschool will give our kids the best education, the best shot at that college we're hoping they get into one day? Is this new policy initiative worth supporting? We don't really know the right answer. In some cases, there is no right answer at all. And even if we have some sense of what we should be doing, we're definitely not entirely sure. So to help resolve our uncertainty, to help figure out what we should do in that situation, we look to others. We look to others and what they're doing, and we follow that. We assume that if other people are doing something, well, it must be a pretty decent idea. It must be pretty good for us to do it as well. Because there's safety in numbers. And those people may know something that we might not. If a destination to go on vacation seems pretty popular, well, we assume that it must be worth checking out. If everyone in the neighborhood sends their kids to a particular school, we assume that it must be pretty good. And if we see lots of signs on other neighbors' yards supporting a particular candidate or a particular policy initiative, we assume it must be good for the community. Another great example of this involves lines. In New York City, Halal Chicken and Gyro offers delicious platters of lamb and chicken, lightly seasoned rice, and pita bread. It's been ranked as one of the top 20 food carts in the city, and people wait up to an hour to get one of these delicious but tasty and inexpensive meals. I've gone myself, let me tell you, it's worth the wait. And visit during peak hours, the line is terrible. It will stretch around the block and around the corner. People sit there for almost an hour more sometimes to get this food. And I know what you're thinking. Well, if that many people are in line, if people are willing to wait an hour, it must be pretty good, right? The food's got to be worth the wait. People must be waiting that long because the food is so amazing. And you are partially right. The food is pretty good. But here's the interesting fact. The owners actually operate an identical food cart across the street. Not perfectly identical, but it's essentially the same thing. Same food, same packaging, basically an identical product. Except one difference. There's no line. In fact, the second truck has never developed the same devout following as its sibling, even though the food is exactly the same. Same food, same packaging, same price, no line. Why not? Well, notice that idea of informational influence. People assume that the longer the line is, the better the food must be. Because we use others as information or a shortcut to judgment. Collecting all the information ourselves would be hard. We don't have time to figure out exactly which food cart is better, so we use that long line as a signal of what we should do ourselves. Say you're new in town and you're trying to find a mechanic in the area who does good work and won't overcharge. How would you find this mechanic? Well, beyond following others, it would take a lot of time and effort. Sure, you could do trial and error. You could walk on each door, knock on the different mechanics' doors, and ask them how much they cost and whether they do good work, but you couldn't really trust them. And imagine finding an honest mechanic and taking your car to different places all over town. If you got work done at each, it would be exhausting and expensive. Alternatively, sure, we could try direct observation, but it's also difficult. You'd have to make friends with all the mechanics in all the different shops and get them to let you watch what they do and how much they charge. And then you have to follow up with each of the clients to see whether those clients were happy. It's really time intensive and costly to collect all that information ourselves. Guess how easily that would work? Not very. And advertisements, as we'll talk later in the section on word of mouth, those also don't work so well. Sure, they make people aware or exposed to information, but people generally don't trust them and are generally skeptical of persuasion attempts. Sure, mechanics will say that they have great service or their prices are fantastic, but without really checking, it's hard to know for sure. So following others saves us time and energy. It allows us a quick shortcut that saves us the time of going place to place or checking in with each mechanic. Now, conformity also leads to behaviors like the herding we saw in language at the beginning of this lecture. People in the Midwest say pop, for example, because that's what other people in the Midwest say. If you move from the Midwest to the East Coast, you'd probably think it was weird at first, and you'd keep saying the thing you were saying before. But soon, eventually, if you live in a place long enough, you'll find yourself tempted to say the same thing as that area. After all, if everyone else is saying it, it just starts to sound right, even while it might not have been right before. Something similar happened to me when I moved from the East Coast to California for college. Washington, D.C. is a reasonably conservative town, not so much in terms of politics necessarily, but definitely in terms of dress code. People in D.C. tend to be a little on the formal side, more suits than jeans, and a lot of people wear ties to the office or to formal events. So I did as well. Growing up, to a formal event, I would wear a tie. But when I moved to California, I took my ties with me. I wore them to the first few formal type events that I had, but then I noticed something that struck me as weird at first. No one was wearing a tie. In fact, where were all those people that I was used to who were wearing ties? The norm was different. I was wearing a tie, but a few other people were doing the same. And eventually, after a while, in that laid-back environment, I started to change too. I started to ditch the tie because it didn't look right, even though it did just a couple years before. Now let's fast forward to 8 or so years later, when I moved back to the East Coast. I moved back to teach at the Wharton School, and by then, most of my ties had either disappeared or been sent to Goodwill. I had a couple I'd been given by friends that had sentimental value, but I pretty much never wore them. But when I walked up the stairs to my first dean's reception at this new job, it was an evening get-together with all the various faculty members, I noticed something I had not seen in a long time. Ties. It was the weirdest sight. I walked in and everyone was wearing a tie, except me. I couldn't fathom why people were wearing them. I mean, it just seemed so formal and out of place and weird. Even though 8 years ago, it would have been exactly what I would have expected, exactly what I would have worn ahead of time. And now it seemed out of place. I hadn't necessarily changed, but my environment had. And that brings me to the second reason people conform: to fit in. If we think about it for a moment, what could be easier than matching the length of two lines? Imagine, for example, you were asked to participate in a very simple vision test. In front of you are a pair of cards. On the left card is a simple line, imagine a line on a piece of paper, and on the right card are three comparison lines, labeled A, B, and C. Your job is pretty easy. Pick the line on the right card that's the same length as the target line on the left card. Decide whether line A, B, or C is the same length as the target line. Should be easy, right? All you have to do is line those two lines up, look with your vision, and see which makes sense. But now, let's add one more wrinkle. Rather than doing the experiment alone, you participate with a larger group of your peers. You show up at a nondescript building on a university campus, and you walk up a flight of stairs into some room labeled B7. When you arrive, you see that there are 6 other people seated in a semicircle around 3 sides of a square table. So you grab the last seat remaining, the second from the end. The experimenter is just starting to explain the instructions, and he reiterates that your job is pretty simple, to pick the line on the right that matches in length the one on the left. Again, seems like the easiest experiment ever. The group will do a number of trials just like that one, and as the group is pretty small, the number of trials is few, he'll call on one person and then the next and so on to make their choice. Each person will announce their choices to the group, and he'll record it on a special form. The experimenter points to the leftmost participant and asks that person to start which line matches. Now, the first participant has red hair, he's wearing a gray collared shirt, and he seems to be around 25 years old. He looks at the lines for a second, he glances one way, and then he looks another, and without missing a beat, he reports his judgment. Line B, he says. The next participant seems a little older, maybe around 27, and is dressed more casually. But he reports the same answer, line B. The third person also says B, as does the fourth and the fifth. And then it gets to you. What's your answer? Asked the experimenter. Which line would you pick? Would you pick the line that you knew was right, actually line A, or would you pick the line that everyone else had said, line B? And might line B start to seem more right just because other people had said it? Well, when psychologist Solomon Asch designed this line length study, he was looking to do more than just test people's vision. He was hoping to prove someone else wrong. Because a few years earlier, another psychologist by the name of Sharif had conducted a similar study and found some pretty surprising results. Sharif was interested in how norms form, how groups of people come to agree on common ways of seeing the world. And to study this question, he put people in a pretty unusual situation. And it's called something like the autokinetic effect. Basically, imagine walking into a dark room, no light at all, and a pinpoint of light is on the wall. Well, Sharif asked people to stare at this point of light, not move their eyes for as long as possible. Then he asked them to report how far that point of light had moved. Now, in reality, that point of light was immobile. He was sort of playing a trick on people. The light hadn't moved at all. But for individuals in the room, the light seemed like it had moved. Staring at a small dot of light in an otherwise dark room is tougher than it sounds. After a while of staring in the darkness, people's eyes eventually fatigue and start to move involuntarily. This causes them to perceive that the light is moving, even if it's been stationary the whole time. Now, Sharif studied the autokinetic effect because he wanted to see how people rely on others when they were uncertain. First, he put them in a dark room by themselves, alone without anyone else present, just them alone in the room. And he found that each person converged on their own norm of judgment. The first time in the room, someone might guess that the light moved maybe 8 inches. The next time through, that person might guess that the light moved 4 inches. Now, in both cases, it didn't move, but one time they guessed 8, and another time they guessed 4. But through a number of trials, repeatedly, they settled on a particular number, say 6 inches, and they stuck with it for the rest of the trials, guessing a similar number again and again and again. But next, Sharif put groups of people in the room at the same time, 2 or 3 participants at once, and each would be asked to call out their judgments to the rest of the room. While different participants often started with different answers, their own personal norm, eventually they came to a common estimate. They all came to agree on the same thing. One participant might have said 6 inches when they were by themselves, and another one might have said 2 inches when they were by themselves, but put those two folks together and their judgments started to converge. The person who said 6 inches might start to make smaller judgments, maybe 4 inches, and the person who said 2 inches might start to make larger judgments, 4 inches as well. It seems like people's estimates conformed to those around them. In fact, this influence was so strong that it persisted even when participants returned to making those individual judgments. Even if after their partners left the room, people came back to the task alone, they continued to give the same answer they had with the group. That group information changed their opinion even when those others weren't around. Now, these findings generate a good bit of controversy. Do people just do what everyone else is doing? Are we mindless automatons that simply follow the actions of others without any thought to what we should be doing ourselves? The very notions of independence and free thought that much of American culture is based on seemed at stake. But this person Asch, this other scientist, wasn't so convinced. Rather than people being mindless followers, he thought that the results demonstrated something else. That people use multiple inputs when making decisions. When people are uncertain about what to do, relying on others makes sense. Not sure how much a point of light moved? Not sure there's really a right answer? Well, listening to what others think makes good sense. And shifting our other judgment in that direction makes good sense as well, because others might have information that you don't.